Hi everyone, I'm really writing this out as a way to vent because I'm in a situation where I feel really stuck. Any advice is appreciated, but I'm not sure there's anything that can be said that will actually help. I've tried just about everything. I'm going to start from the beginning. This is a story 2 years in the making, so I'll try to be as thorough as possible. In 2019, I graduated with my master's degree and moved to a relatively rural area for my PhD. Thinking we'd make an investment, my dad and I purchased a house. The intent was to rent it out once I completed my PhD. This house was only a block away from a dive bar where my dad was able to make some pretty good friends. He introduced me to everyone, and everyone let me know that I would be so happy in my new house because my next-door neighbor was the absolute nicest guy you could ever meet. So we met the neighbor, and he did seem nice enough. He suggested we exchange numbers just in case I ever needed anything, and I thought that was a good idea. What's the worst that could happen? A few days later, my dad left to go back to his home in another state, and I was left to my own devices. Literally the day he left, it started. My neighbor texted me while I was away and let me know he left a gift for me on my front porch. In this text exchange, he started using pet names like Sweetie and Cutie. I went home and he had left a hand-painted feeding dish for my cats in my mailbox. At this point, I wasn't that alarmed. He was just being nice, I thought. The next day, he sent me more texts with pet names, and I took the opportunity to make sure he knew I was not interested in anything romantic. He replied back with a rambling text about how all a person ever needs is friends, and he would like to be friends with me. After that, he would send me texts frequently, everything from inviting me fishing to telling me he left more gifts on my porch. I would often not reply, or I would tell him I'm busy. I didn't want to be rude, but I also had no interest in any sort of relationship with him, other than neighborly. One night, I got a text from the manager of the bar down the street, letting me know that if my neighbor knocked on my door, I shouldn't answer. She then told me that my neighbor had walked down to the bar with a hatchet and told the bartender he was hearing voices that got louder as he got closer to the bar. He threatened to kill someone with the hatchet if the voices didn't stop. They called the police, and the police took the hatchet from him but made no arrest. The manager of the bar picked me up and I spent the night at her house. She told me that the police said my neighbor was on meth. After that, I tried to keep my distance even more. But things got even weirder. One day, I went out to my car to find a dead squirrel in my driveway. This squirrel had very clearly been run over and moved to right in front of my driver's side door. I just stepped over it, got in my car, and left. When I returned home, the squirrel was gone. Shortly after, I received a text from my neighbor that said, "Someone or something put a dead squirrel in your driveway. Don't worry, I moved it for you." I felt like this was a weird way to word this, and I suspect he's the one who put the squirrel in my driveway. Another time, I walked out of my house to see he had placed an unspent shotgun shell on the bricks in his front yard. He came out and told me that it was to serve as a warning for anyone walking between our houses. For the next couple of months, I did my best to avoid him. He would text me inviting me over, and I would come up with an excuse or just ignore him completely. I wanted to remain cordial since he was my neighbor, but it was getting very annoying and I was uncomfortable. He would text me as soon as I got home, telling me that he was watching me come and go from my house. Around Halloween, he handcrafted a large casket and wrote, "Here lies the last son of a bitch who played mind games." November 2012. What the fuck? All this time still sending me texts. Eventually, I got fed up and I stopped responding completely. Less than 2 weeks after I stopped responding completely, he threw a 50-pound flower pot at my front door. You know those big concrete planters? Yeah, one of those. I called the police, who advised me to get a stalking no-contact order. A few days later, I was watching TV when a notification popped up that my neighbor was trying to cast a video to my screen. I declined it twice. I filed another report with the police. During this time, I started the process of getting a stalking no-contact order. I saw 3 different victim advocates who all told me different things. I went out of town for a conference, and during that time, someone had attempted to break into my home. I had an ADT security system, so while they didn't succeed, I was aware of the attempt. After the conference, I came home to the entire world shutting down because of COVID. I was trapped in my home 24/7 with my stalker neighbor next door. Luckily, court proceedings for protection orders didn't stop. Right before court, he sent me a text telling me he was sorry for what he'd done, that he could tell when he saw me outside that he made me uncomfortable. Then he went on to tell me he can tell my hair has gotten longer and I look beautiful. I went to court and provided all of the evidence I had. The timeline of everything that had ever happened. The texts he'd sent me asking if I wanted a massage. The texts I sent him telling him the way he was speaking to me was inappropriate. The text saying that he knew he made me uncomfortable. I told the judge that I suspected he had attempted to break into my house while I was out of town. The kicker is, he didn't deny any of it. Actually, he told the judge that he took full accountability for everything. He said he was in recovery and was trying to turn over a new leaf. He didn't oppose the protection order at all. So in March 2020, I actually received the stalking no contact order. Everything was pretty quiet for a while. I mean, he did some weird shit, but that's because he's a weird guy. It wasn't anything that made me fear for my safety. That is, until he got on drugs again. At this time, we found an unspent shotgun casing in my flower bed. It was consistent with the one he had previously used to send a warning. This occurred a couple months after I started dating my boyfriend, and I suspect it was a warning to him. After this, and for a variety of reasons, my boyfriend moved in with me. He moved in pretty quickly, but everything turned out fine. We're still together and as happy in our relationship as we can be. New Year's 2021, I was awoken to yelling. I turned on my security cameras and got footage of him sticking his head out his window and screaming obscenities at my bedroom window for about 7 minutes. It doesn't sound like a long time, but when your stalker is screaming threats and obscenities, 7 minutes is a long time. He called me a harlot. He said, "Happy fucking New Year." He said he was going to blow up his house with his gas line. I called the police, who responded. They told me that he never said my name, so they can't prove it was a violation of the protection order. The officer said, and I quote, "There's nothing illegal about yelling in your own house." They left without even speaking to him. All I could do at this point was do my best to avoid him. I parked on the street because my driveway is pretty close to his front porch. I got used to living with my curtains drawn. I always made sure my cameras were charged, all 5 of them. Yes, because of him, I spent over $1,000 on cameras. Every inch of my yard is covered. Since then, he's been seen by me and by other neighbors talking to people who aren't there, going outside and screaming nonsense. Things like, "I have Cheerios on my necklace," or, "I'll put my penis in your butt." I'm not even joking. This basically brings me to last week. In the morning, I was getting ready for the day when I heard screaming. "Someone is going to die over this sweatshirt." I turned on the cameras. I got footage of him walking around the alley behind my house screaming, "Are you fucking proud? How about I get my shotgun? I'll get everybody all fired up." I called the police. Once again, they didn't charge him with violation of the protection order. Instead, they gave him an ordinance violation for disturbing the peace. The police told me that it seems like he's off his medication again. And that was that. They left. Last night, I was awoken to hammering outside my window at 1 a.m. He was cutting down his privacy fence, horizontally. I called the police for a noise complaint, and they just told him to stop. And that was that. As I write this, he is outside continuing to horizontally cut down his privacy fence. That means the privacy fence only stands about 3 feet tall now. This was the one thing that made me feel relatively safe about hanging out in my backyard, and now that's gone. All of this is to say, I'm fucking tired. I just want to live in a house where I can be sure that my neighbor won't try to kill me, where I can feel confident that he's not going to try to break in. My boyfriend and I are trying to buy a house to move, but it's difficult. I'm a PhD student, so I don't make very much money. Renting won't work because I have 4 cats, plus my partner's cat and dog, although we have a place secured for them if necessary. And finding a place to rent with so many animals is difficult, if not impossible. I refuse to rehome them, so maybe it's partially my fault I'm stuck in this situation. My dad has agreed to co-sign on another mortgage, and I've gotten a second job. We should be able to save up enough money within a few months, but until then, I'm stuck. I just don't know what else to do. I'm tired. I'm angry. So I figured I'd write this to vent. If you've made it this far, thanks for reading it all. There's still so many different instances that I've left out. I'm just so exhausted. Spoiler alert, I'm a lesbian. I thought this was a pretty well-known fact, but I guess no one had thought to tell my old neighbors. Actually, they just presumed my girlfriend was my roommate until they caught us kissing through the kitchen window. I remember that day, and how it was pretty normal. My neighbors seemed friendly, a little too perfect white family, but still friendly. The mother and I had both had a garden, and we'd spend some time talking about how our plants were going. She always had a weird laugh, like a donkey trying to be feminine, but I ignored it. The laugh wasn't the weirdest part. It wasn't even 5 minutes after the kiss that her husband was at our door. He was a bigger man, beefy, with a balding head of dark hair and thick eyebrows that seemed to move on their own accord. My girlfriend once said he looked like a Harry Potter character. I agreed. He started off with shouting at us. It was rather bizarre, since his shouting got so loud that I had seen the across-the-street neighbor peek her head out to see what was wrong. It was mainly the generic stuff. God's will, you're going to hell. How dare you talk to my children? Their sons were 18 and 21. I thought that was one strange. My girlfriend, always the negotiator, managed to talk him down and back to his home. We went to bed silent that night, like speaking would remind us of what had just happened. I said we ought to move. The neighbors hate us. She said it didn't matter. There would always be rude neighbors. I wish we would have moved. The series of events between that day and 5 months later, where we finally found refuge in my brother's house, was god-awful. It started with my garden getting ripped out, my flower stems snapped, and their roots showing. My carrots, which I was so proud of, upturned and smushed beneath a boot. Someone had taken a shovel and dug up clumps of dirt, just to make sure nothing else could grow. I'm not ashamed to admit I cried. When my girlfriend left for work an hour later, the D slur was carved over and over into the paint of our car. It covered nearly every inch of the left side door, and a few scattered across the right. Our headlights were smashed. They had let the air out of our tires. She called in sick. One night at nearly 4 a.m, their oldest son stood at our door and rang the doorbell for 15 minutes straight. He only stopped when my girlfriend opened the upstairs window and said she would call the police. He also urinated on our porch furniture. Every morning I would take our dog out for a mile-long walk. He's a golden retriever, so he needed the exercise. It didn't take long for the youngest to follow after us, shouting obscenities and saying he would fuck the gay right out of me. It got so bad that my neighbor on my other side, a 20-something gym nut, had to start walking with me. One of them taped a note on our door saying they would burn the house down, burn us for our sins. The police said there was no evidence for who it was. We stopped going to the police. Their sons filled water balloons up with urine and threw them at my house. Our dog had an outside bowl of water, and we found that it too had been urinated in. Another time it was rat poison, though that seemed like too big of an accusation. So we told ourselves we were wrong. I was continuously calling family members during this time. My parents thought the idea was crazy. It had to be some misunderstanding. Why, that sounds like it came straight from a movie. It couldn't be that bad. It was the rat poison that did it for us. Even though we told ourselves it was fake, the anxiety of one of us dying had gotten too much. I called my brother in tears, and he was there to help us pack by the next day. He also chewed the neighbors from hell out, which was the perfect way for it to end. For some background information, I am a 22-year-old woman who grew up at my parents' house in southern Mississippi, USA, in a very small, secluded neighborhood that roughly 15 other people lived in as well. This neighborhood is connected to a river that runs behind it that have trails leading to the river, with an old paved road connecting the houses. From the age of 10, my parents warned me about a man that lived on the corner over a hill down the road from my parents' house. My parents called him Dirty Joe, and he lived with his dad, who they called Yankee Joe. I was told never to go down that road in front of their house by myself. I didn't question my parents because I knew they were concerned for my safety. So fast forward to when I was 15. I was at a friend's house. It was a Saturday afternoon. I rode my bike to my friend's house, which was on the other side of the neighborhood. Eventually I had to leave, so I left around 5 p.m. I was riding my bike, and instead of taking the long way to my house, I decided to take the shorter way, which would be using the road in front of Dirty Joe's house. Big mistake. Knowing of my parents' warning, I began to pedal as fast as I could. I was passing the house when out of no, where a bearded man with brown eyes that looked to be about 35 approached me and got in front of my bike. He said, "Hey, can I ask you a question?" I tried to get around him, but he grabbed my handlebars and held the bike still, and I wasn't going to leave my bike with him. So I irritatingly responded with, "Yeah, what?" He said, "Will you marry me?" I was of course shocked and disgusted at the same time and blurted out, "No, you're like 35. He then proceeded to tell me that he liked me most out of all the other girls in the neighborhood, who were my friends, because I didn't seem like a slut. I was terrified by that point and was still struggling to free my handlebars. He holds my handlebars so tight, his fists are turning white. He then begins to tell me that when my friend Misty was walking home one night 2 years ago from my parents' house, He grabbed her off the road in front of his house and tied her up and raped her right on his front porch. After hearing this, I was extremely petrified and immediately passed out. When I came to, he was crouched over me, asking me, "Are you okay? Do you need to come inside for a minute?" I jerked up and said, "Hell no, stay the fuck away from me." Miraculously, was able to grab my bike and ride as fast as I could home and immediately told my dad, who then scolded me for going down that road alone. I immediately called Misty and asked if it was true, and she began crying and saying yes. I couldn't believe it. I told Misty that I needed to call the cops, but she begged me not to because she didn't want to deal with it all over again. I respected her wishes and didn't call them only because she asked me not to. But it didn't stop there. A few years later, when I was 17, I was at my neighbor's house, and my friend, who was 22 and much bigger than I was, wanted to go to the river that was on the other side of the neighborhood. She wanted to use the shorter way, which meant we had to use the road in front of Dirty Joe's house. I didn't like the idea, but I wasn't alone this time. We began walking, and we had just reached the top of the hill when a straggly, frail, skinny old man with a long white beard came out of the bushes. I recognized him as Yankee Joe, Dirty Joe's father. He looks at me and my friend and says, "Don't let him touch her, because he will hurt her," and points to his son, Dirty Joe, who is standing near the road in front of his house. My friend bluntly said, "He will not touch her as long as I am here, or I will hurt him." The old man just started to laugh hysterically. This truly unnerved me, but my friend insisted that we keep walking. We walked right past him, and he didn't do anything but stare at us, mostly at me, until he could no longer see me. It does make me think, what if I were alone that time? Would he have tried something? So creepy man named Dirty Joe, let's not meet ever again. Update. I recently visited my parents' house and was talking to them about normal things when my dad mentions that the old guy that lived on the hill right before Dirty Joe's house had gone missing and no one can find him. This old man was at least 80 years old and not very mobile. What makes it even more creepy is that Dirty Joe and Yankee Joe are now living in that house instead of their own house, and are also using the old guy's land for their personal storage. The cops are investigating it, but I wouldn't doubt that they murdered the old man for his land and property. I shared this true story in hopes that it will make people more aware of the people around them and that a neighbor is not always friendly.